All right, and I'll pass it over to you, Tatiana.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for a great afternoon and a very interesting but needed topic in our industry. So, Mike, if you could just start by introducing yourself and your role at House of Dank.
Sure. Well, first, thank you and Isaiah so much for having me out today. It's always nice to be back and talking with members of the MICIA about, one of the things I like the most, and that's, cannabis in Michigan. It seems to be the one topic I can't stop talking about no matter where I'm at. So I think I'm in the right place to keep going for sure. But I am the Chief Corporate Officer and General Counsel for House of Dank. And what that means is that I am in charge of all of the legal aspects of our enterprise. And as Chief Corporate Officer, marketing, HR, finance ultimately fall under my purview as well. So I've kind of got my hands in a little bit of everything. Before House of Dank, I've been a lawyer for over 20 years and worked in the financial services industry. And I also had a short stint as the general counsel of an influencer marketing agency here in Detroit called the Out Loud Group. So I'm well versed in both cannabis and advertising. So I think that I'm ready to go and answer some questions today for sure.
That definitely is unique experience when you have someone with a legal background, though, that also has a layer and a lens of marketing. That's very unique. So along those lines, we know that there are varying layers of cannabis compliance, but I don't think it's as clear from a marketing perspective what that looks like. Can you share what are some specific rules that cannabis companies need to adhere to?
Sure. And then, there's really a variety of rules. So we're going to talk a little bit in broad context about, those things that all of us in business have to worry about and think about when we begin marketing. And I'm talking about the Federal Trade Commission. I'm talking about consumer protection acts that are both within the state and at the federal level. And, ultimately, what it usually boils down to is false and misleading. In general, any of your advertising cannot be false and misleading, and that is barred by any number of statutes, be they state or federal. So just as a broad stroke, you definitely want to look at, the FTC and any consumer protection laws that are in your state. The FTC has a great website, particularly if you're going to be working with influencers. We all know right now that one of the ascendant stars in the marketing world is YouTube, Twitch, Instagram influencers. When you're working with these men and women who have built their communities, again, I strongly encourage you to check out the FTC bulletins to make sure that they are also posting in a compliant manner, independent of some of the cannabis stuff. So I think that's really the first thing that you want to make sure of, is that independent of cannabis, you are marketing and advertising your new brand in a compliant manner. And then when we talk about cannabis in Michigan, you're really talking about Rule 42507. That is the marketing and advertising rule under the Consolidated Joint Rules. That's going to apply both in the medical marketplace as well as the adult use marketplace. And there are a number of things that you either have to do or you are prohibited from doing, and they're enumerated in that statute. And the first one is which I really just discussed, and that is you absolutely have to comply with all existing laws that are on the books. Now, this can be as minute as signage. We've got an issue in one of our stores across the state where the individual municipality has an ordinance against using slang terms for drugs or alcohol in signage. We are House of Dank. Naturally, I made a good faith effort to argue that dank was not, in fact, slang for cannabis. It was half-hearted and failed. But ultimately, we were not able to use that name in that town. We had to go with HOD. So you have to start with what's going on locally and take a look at the state and then kind of work backwards ultimately. So that's the first rule when we take a look at the Michigan cannabis specific rules, is again to make sure that you're complying with all of the other applicable rules. The second one is kind of reiterates what we talked about as well earlier, and that is false and misleading. Even though this exists in really every statutory and regulatory body in regards to advertising and public comments, where you're inducing people to buy your products, false and misleading is the death knell. Now, where that ties into cannabis actually comes in a little bit later, where the MRA and the rule set talks a little bit more specifically about what that can mean in a cannabis setting. So I'm going to hold off on that and just kind of go in order here. Number three is advertising regarding health and health benefits. it's not okay. At the end of the day, we are selling, particularly on the medical side, medical cannabis is based on a prescription and obviously has a tremendous amount of medical uses. I use it myself to help get sleep and to reduce stress. So there are a number of ways to use this medication. However, we as businesses and marketers have to be very careful that you cannot tout the health benefits of these products without having a letter from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, from the feds, indicating that they have tested and they believe the things that you're marketing to the public. So it kind of ties into that false and misleading a little bit, that you can't overstep when you're talking about some of the health benefits and whether or not an individual product will have specific health outcomes. Another one that is unique to cannabis, and again, moving down the line here of Rule 42507, is whom you are marketing to. And this really is very unique. Michigan does not allow a cannabis business to market, and that can mean posting a billboard, an advertisement on a website, or print advertising, radio even, if the target audience may be more than 30% younger than either 18 on the medical side or 21. Okay, so let's break that down, okay? At the end of the day, you cannot advertise to young people. Now, what you need to do is when you're working with your counterparts in the advertising world, any reputable marketing company will be able to help you get this information. We have worked with radio stations, with publications, be they magazines, newspapers, any and all websites. All of them will come with a demographic sheet that will let you know who your audience is. That's the data. That's what we're paying for. We want to know who we're delivering our message to. And what you're able to do with that is immediately determine the average age of the audience that you are talking to. What I suggest you do from a compliance standpoint is for each and every ad that you're going to run, request that from the company that you're going to run that ad and keep it in your file. If and when later on down the line, the MRA has questions about a particular ad and whether or not it reached an audience that perhaps was a little bit younger, you've got yourself some empirical evidence to indicate that you were aware of the rule, you looked into it, and this is what you made your decision based on, that the audience as represented to you by the marketing company was less than which would be disallowable. The next one's a little tricky as well, and that is that when you get into licensing and branding, and this really comes into the white box world, which some of our new listeners may not be as familiar with, but one of the phenomenons that's happening in both Michigan and with states across the country that are opting in now to cannabis is that we are seeing national brands try to slide across the country. And a lot of these brands are built on the back of license agreements as opposed to building physical facilities and spending a lot of capital to actually gain access to those individual markets. So what will happen is a large brand, let's use California, for instance, and let's use my example of Argyle Cannabis. Let's say Argyle Cannabis was a very large California-based cannabis company, a very large brand, and they wanted to migrate to the Michigan market. Well, they may cut a deal with either a processor or a grower or both, whereby that grower would be able to use the marks and the brand of Argyle Cannabis to bring it to market in the state of Michigan. Now that's going to have a licensing and branding deal that is part of a whole different seminar, and I encourage you to watch that as well. But you will need to know that any of those licensing or branding deals, you are going to have to submit those to the state of Michigan so that they can get those approved. There's a whole set of rules you've got to follow along with those. But how that ties into advertising is as follows. In the example that I just used, if again, Argyle Cannabis is our California company, if I am a Michigan licensee and I am running advertisements for Argyle Cannabis, I am responsible for making sure they are compliant. But if Argyle Corporate in California is also running ads that I haven't paid for, that I haven't been involved in for their brand in Michigan, they and I are also responsible for those advertisements. So it does create a situation where you as the licensee in this instance and the licensor, Argyle Brands, both have to make sure that you're in compliance because ultimately you may be both indemnifying one another. The next two are fairly straightforward when we talk about the enumerated rules for advertising. And that is that if it's a medical product, it has to be labeled and marketed as a medical product. You really can't go back and forth. And we really see this more on the concentrate side and the gummy side. and edibles rather than the flower side naturally. And then lastly, and again, it's redundant. And for those of you who haven't spent 20 years practicing law, most laws are ultimately redundant when you go through the statutes. They reiterate that you are absolutely prohibited from marketing any of these products to someone under 17. But it didn't end there insofar as what the state of Michigan has enumerated and told us as licensees that we can or cannot do. There are a series of bulletins which are available on the MRA website. If you scroll down about 3/4 of the way on the main home screen, you will see a button there that indicates that you can take a look at their rules, laws, and bulletins. If you go ahead and click that, that is a great resource to see all of the rules that I'm talking about here today, as well as the individual bulletins. Well, you'll see in those bulletins that back on 6/22 of 2020, there was a bulletin regarding the use of the word dispensary. And dispensary has kind of become like Kleenex now for Michigan cannabis companies, where it is ultimately become a common noun to describe any type of retail cannabis facility. But in actuality, the state of Michigan does not allow any licensee to market themselves as a dispensary. That is not something that you are permitted to market on your signage, on your exterior, both online, on your internal or external networks. They're really pushing away from the term dispensary, as they believe that causes confusion in the marketplace with pharmacies. So it's something that most people don't recognize. And I know that we had to talk about it internally with our outside marketing team when this bulletin came out, to make sure that they understood, particularly when it comes to keyword searching, because that's where this is really the disconnect between Michigan law and the way that Americans are using the internet to find these businesses. There's a disconnect there. Overwhelmingly, when someone is searching for a cannabis retailer near them, they're using the term dispensary. Again, it's become almost a common noun for these stores now. Well, unfortunately, when you put dispensary into Google here in Michigan, you're barred from using that in your name or otherwise. You can use it in your metadata for your keywords, but you can't put it front and center because you'd be violating Michigan law at that point. So what it creates is they're looking for you, but they're not able to find you based on the number one keyword that they normally would. So that itself creates a bit of a unique situation, and it really segues, I think, into the third category of things that we all have to be mindful of when we're advertising cannabis, and that is private regulation. So again, we have non-cannabis regulations at the state and federal level. We have cannabis-specific marketing rules at the state level for us, and then we have these private regulations. And what I'm really talking about here are the rules for Instagram and Facebook and Google, and how and where they will take your money so you can run targeted ads on their platforms in order to broaden your reach and get more customers. As of right now, it is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to advertise on this duopoly of Google and Facebook, Instagram. I'm going to read from you for a moment Instagram's policy on the sale of marijuana. That Instagram doesn't allow people or organizations to use the platform to advertise or sell marijuana, regardless of the seller's state or country. So regardless that it is safe to sell and legal to sell here in the state of Michigan, Facebook, Google, and Instagram will not allow you to use their platforms to run paid ads. So we're forced to use just a typical page, if you will, and not run retargeting ads. But even then, we have to tread carefully because we are not permitted to actually market products for sale. And I know that all of us in the cannabis space are very familiar with these ads. And this is not for sale. This is just a display, when we see it on Instagram all the time. But that's why they have to go ahead and do that. And I tell you what, of these three main bodies of law that you have to navigate to do all this compliantly, again, this federal and state cannabis and the private, it's the private stuff that's going to throw you off the most. It changes the most. Getting a straight answer is the hardest. Unlike the federal government or state government, the MRA, whose rules are written down, and lawyers and paralegals and whatnot can go and research them and actually read them, it is exceedingly difficult to really know what the community guidelines are specifically for Instagram, Facebook, and otherwise, not just on paid ads, but what can trigger to actually have an account removed, as I don't know any of us in the cannabis space that hasn't woken up one morning to losing a whole bunch of followers and having one of their accounts shut down. So with that being I feel like I've been talking for an hour, Tatiana. I'll kind of throw it back to you if I've gone too far. What do you think?
No. I think that's great. That's one thing I was actually going to share is, I'm in a number of industry Facebook groups, and exactly what you just described is oftentimes what happens is, you hear brands getting online like, oh my goodness, they shut down my account.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that's very important to make clear, just because it really does happen. That is real life right there.
It's
Especially,
heartbreaking too. I tell you what, it is heartbreaking. I mean, I was working with a client once. I mean, when you work really hard to get up to 60, 70, 80,000 followers. And I know that in the world of TikTokers and everything that sounds small, it's not, right? Like you work really hard to build that base, and given the lack of other avenues to get your message out, to wake up one morning and lose that, it's just it's like you lost a pet. That's how I would describe it.
agreed. So I know that you shared an area on the MRA website where people can access this information. One, can you repeat that? And then two, are there any other resources or places that you recommend people going to learn more about exactly what we're talking about?
First and foremost, definitely go to the MRA website, michigan.gov/MRA. That is the number one resource, and they've got a pretty clean page ultimately. And again, if you scroll about 3/4 of the way down, you'll see a beautiful standard Wix graphic that they have used on their web page, to denote where the laws, rules, grants, and other bulletins are. And then once you click on that, you're able to access really everything you need to know about Michigan cannabis. And I say this to particularly young lawyers, but I think that it is really good message for all of our listeners out there. If you can think it, there's probably a rule on it. So your first instinct should be to go and try to find what the rule is and where that rule may sit amongst the other rules, because it is highly unlikely that what you are conceiving or the things that are happening to you are that novel that no one has had them happen before, or that they haven't been thought about. So I think that's really, this is a page that even myself, that I am on weekly, if not more than weekly, constantly looking at something new, particularly with the bulletins that come out on a fairly regular basis. While there, I strongly suggest that everyone also signs up and subscribes to get the automatic updates. You will get a lot of things, and you'll be one of the first to know when you wake up with that email and get some information from the MRA. It can be a little dense at times. About 3 weeks ago, they had sent out some policy initiatives, but really interesting stuff. I mean, they're talking about adding a transactional tax to the Michigan cannabis market. They are talking about reinstituting the medical excise tax and expanding some of the micro business licensing. And all of this exists within these bulletins that you can find if you come to the page, but you can also have them delivered right to your email. So I think those are the two primary pages. And then lastly, I would say really to hit the FTC website, because particularly when you're working online and with influencers, and you'll excuse my lack of eye contact as I take a look. But the FTC is really about protecting American consumers, and you have to put that hat on for a minute. That so many of us, when we're thinking about these things, we forget that in this instance, we're not the consumer. Okay, like we're who they're being protected against from. All right, we are the retailers, and I know that none of us are doing this, with any ill intent. But when you're going through this stuff, remember that they're trying to protect your clients from anything that you may do to mislead them in some way.
Got it. Yep. I think that's very important for us to be cognizant of. What are some perhaps non-obvious rules that one should be aware of, and just kind of always have in the back of their heads?
Boy, I think that the one that never leaves our heads is what you post on Facebook and Instagram in regards to your store's page. Because we walk that walk so carefully in regards to losing our followers and losing our pages. So that's I think the number one thing. The other stuff seems to be, it looks harder than it is, and what you'll find is that complying with the rules is fairly straightforward. What it does is it limits your outlets for where you can deliver your advertising. And I think that's really the other side of this. that it's not so much what you're allowed to say, but where you're allowed to say it. And I think we come back to this idea of being locked out of the Facebook and Google duopoly.
Mhm.
Most of us, when we get served advertising nowadays, we're not even 100% sure it's an advertisement. It's so hyper targeted that if you buy a pair of slacks on Saturday, Tuesday you are getting pummeled on your Instagram with new designers for pants. And that is something that nearly every industry is moving over to. And when you go to marketing conferences and you talk about not the future of marketing, but where we're at today, it's all digital. I hear it all the time. The cannabis industry in Michigan is dominating the billboard game. I think that everybody can pretty much admit to that, right?
I think we can all attest to that.
Yeah. Um, and I think what people don't realize is that that is one of the few outlets that we can use.
Mhm.
The print media is almost non-existent. I don't think that anyone has picked up a newspaper, but for maybe a Metro Times type thing in a pretty long time. We get all of that stuff online now, and those ads are far more difficult to purchase and bid on when you're a cannabis company. And that kind of relates back to the Safe Banking Act and some of the illegality of moving the money around at the federal level. But that's really where I think the innovation has to come from, and where we have to work a little harder. It's again not so much trying to stay compliant and not saying the word dispensary. And none of us want to target to kids. We know that, all right. Like I don't want to sell kids this stuff, but I do want to market to as broad a base of people as possible. And so where you do that and how you do that, I think is really a much more interesting discussion rather than just the hardcore compliance. Because other than the 7, 8 things that we talked about, and really this core of false and misleading, sky's the limit on advertising it. And it only takes one day a year, the Super Bowl Sunday, to see the type of creativity that we see in modern advertising. That some of it never talks about the product, some of it is brand building, some of it is specific to sales. And I think that that's something that as the listeners talk about launching their new brands, they have to start getting in their own minds this difference between sales and marketing. You may be running advertisements to generate sales, but that might be a little bit different than the brand building and the marketing that you're doing in order to build your brand up. They're ultimately, different tactics and different results that you're going to see, when you enter the marketplace.
Right. Got it. At what point would you say someone needs to get outside counsel from, especially from a non-marketing side? So I think, people bring in their in-house marketing people, they may work with agencies and things of that sort. But at what point do they need to consult with someone with, your level of expertise, or do you think they can rely on the creative and marketing teams when it comes to this stuff?
I think that you really have to walk the line. I am not going to indicate that each and every licensee, as they launch a brand, needs to have dedicated IP or marketing counsel on staff or on retainer to walk them through this stuff. I don't think that it's legally that difficult. I really don't. I think that the difficulty again arises in the where and the how to get the word out, more so than staying compliant. But to your point, I think the best way to handle this is that I've yet to really meet a licensee, excuse me, that has done this alone. All of us have had a little bit of help with the rules, be it dedicated counsel, paralegal, maybe an accountant, but someone who has kind of helped them through. What I would suggest you do is go back to that professional that helped you get licensed and talk to them about marketing, and get down into language that you and your team can digest and understand and implement, and just cover some ground rules. And then I think that if you have some bright line rules of what you can and can't do, both from a strategy as to how we're trying to build our brand, as well as staying legally compliant, if you take those guideposts and then bring them to your creative team, then I think you've given your creative team, again, these rails to stay within, and then go crazy in between. And that means you don't have to keep coming back to the no fun men and women in your office, the lawyers and whatnot, who constantly have to say no to ideas. So you set those guardrails up first, and then let the creative people go wild.
Great. And are there any best practices that you would recommend, especially for companies that are in the incubator phase or in the startup phase, and they are trying to be as scrappy and nimble as possible?
Insofar as best practices, I think go early insofar as branding. It is never too early to start getting your name out there, even if you don't have product, even if there's nothing in the bag. Again, take a look at the non-cannabis world, and movies are teased years before they come out, and that works. So build up a little anticipation towards your product, and don't put branding on the back end, because as we see this marketplace continue to explode, and we see the equilibrium of supply and demand in the regulated marketplace, branding is what's going to drive sales. So I think that, to all of the listeners out there, you should be establishing a brand and trying to figure out where you fit into this cannabis marketplace with your brand as early as possible, and then get started. That isn't something you should wait until you have a product ready to bring to market. It should be something that you're starting way early. I know when we talk to companies and potential new vendors, and they come and visit us, those that have a marketing deck and a mood board, there's a lot of different names for it, but having a set of marketing materials already in place really helps a retailer choose to purchase your product. And that's really what's going to come down here at some point, is that you not only have to get the public to know and want to buy your product, but if you are a grower, you've got to get your product into a buyer's hands at a retail company so that they purchase it and want to put it on the shelf. And one of the ways to do that is by having a well-developed brand identity, even without product, because what you're signaling to the world, both your end consumer as well as these retailers and your wholesale consumer, is that you're taking it seriously, and you have what it takes to go forward. You've thought these things through, and you're going to be providing marketing support. Because I can tell you from a retailer standpoint, the last thing we want to do is take on a name brand where they've given up. All they've done is give us the product, and it's our job to sell it off of our shelves. We want some help, and we would rather work with vendors and individuals that are in it to win it as well with us on the branding game, and are showing us that, independent of what we're doing to try to sell their product in our stores, that they are working outside of that to have a plan, with strong branding and strong advertising as well. So I think it's something that you absolutely cannot overlook, particularly in a market that is moving toward being such a commodity as is particularly flower on the cannabis side. The branding is really going to be everything.
Great. Okay. Are there any final closing thoughts? We're seeing if there's any questions in the chat. But if none come in, if you could just let us know any closing final thoughts on the subject matter.
Advertising is fascinating. All right. I mean, I think it is one of the most interesting parts of this cannabis puzzle that is unfolding a little bit as some of the barriers break down as to where we can advertise. I mean, just this week, Apple announced that you're allowed to create apps now for the first time as a cannabis company inside the Apple universe. So that's going to create more and more retargeting opportunities. So I think my final thought again is get a brand early and stay with best practices and keep that bleeding edge as we get toward more and more digital advertising, because each and every day, more and more of those private regulations go away, and the public ones are something that are not overwhelming and that you should be able to live with no problem. So I hope we have some great questions, though. And hey, obviously, if you need me, you can always reach me at miked@shophod.com. I'll be happy to take your email, and if anything I can help you with, I'll see what I can do.
Awesome. Thank you again for your willingness to talk to us this afternoon, straight coming right off the holiday. And your preparation for the subject at hand as well. Isaiah, you want to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more time, thank you guys both for your time today. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Tatiana. And please look out for any updates for the next one on our MICI Facebook page. Like I said earlier, this video will be up on our YouTube page for further reference. And Mike, what was your email one more time?
Mike D@shophod. For all of my old listeners out there, it's my Beastie Boys reference. All right. MIKE to the D. You come and see me and you pay a fee. I mean, come on.
I love it.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and we'll see you on the next.
There's a question.
Oh, I love it.
And where?
Okay. Let's see.
Did it come in?
Let's see.
She said, I had a question. I'm sorry. And let's see. Let's give her about a minute for the question to come in.
No, for sure. Look, it's hard for other people too. I mean, we're all kind of dealing with a bit of a holiday hangover. And you know, the older I get in life, the more I realize that like 4th of July, it's legit Christmas in summertime. All right. Like nobody is around. Everybody goes somewhere. Everybody's got something to do. I mean, it is like the #2 holiday, I think, in America by far for people like getting out of here and work shutting down. So I don't blame everybody if their heads are in a beach somewhere doing something else.
Got it. Okay. The question is, what would you say is the most common mistake you see new cannabis brands have?
Using names that are so obviously protected by someone else's trademark that you're not going to get anywhere with these. And look, it sounds great. And I think that we see this in the caregiver world, in that traditional market a lot more than we do so now. But there are a number of brands out there, and I'll give you one that was just in the news recently. There was a dispensary out, and I think it was in Washington State, called Budway. And it was stylized very much to look like Subway. You could get away with that 7 years ago, okay? Because Subway wasn't watching, and that stuff is fire on the streets. You can move that. But when we're entering this regulated marketplace, these play on words where you are taking someone else's brand and just changing it just a little bit. It's cute and it's going to grab some sales early, but long term, any bankers, lawyers are going to look at you and they're not going to want to invest in you because you're looking at some type of cease and desist or trademark issues. A brand has to be unique to your own. So it is easy, but ultimately lazy to take somebody else's and change a couple of letters in an attempt to kind of glom on to some other brand, be it cannabis or otherwise. But that is by far the #1 mistake that I see. Be unique, be yourself, and stay away from the puns.
Got it. Great. Well, that is the only question that I see that has come through. So
I think there was one more for
Oh,
on that same one. They had like a one on top of that. It was what do you wish you knew getting started?
Starting the brand earlier. No question about it. You know what I mean? And I think that here at House of Dank, they've done an incredible job of that. And I'm lucky enough to work with a brand that is such a legacy brand in and around the state of Michigan. But prior to me joining House of Dank, I was a partner at a cannabis-based law firm, and I worked with a number of different clients. And I wish I would have been a bit firmer about really pushing to establish brands early, because I think that right now, when you look at the marketplace, there are no brands. Even those that we've heard of are really barely imprinted on anyone's psyche at this point in relationship to some of those brands that we can't get away from. And I think going forward, 5, 10, however many years, it is going to be vital to build your brand. And I mean, we can use the Michigan craft beer industry as a great example of, Bell's and Shorts. I mean, these are two remarkably successful Michigan businesses. And, the beer is good, but the brand is better. And I think that that's something that I wish I would have focused on a little bit sooner and a little bit quicker with some of my early clients.
Excellent. Isaiah, did we get everything?
I think we got everything.
Excellent.
Well, thank you both so much. I had a great time.
Same.
Yes, thank you. Todd and Mike, I do appreciate your time. As we wrap up, I don't see any more questions coming through. And like I said before, please check our social media outlets to see on any updates for the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.